The judge smirked as he handed down the fine, convinced he was putting a nobody in her place. But just moments later, the courtroom gasped as the woman he belittled pulled out her badge. This was no ordinary defendant. She was the federal prosecutor who could change his fate forever. The courtroom was a place of order, of structure, where power was measured in robes, gavels, and the unshaken authority of the man sitting high above the rest. Judge Richard Thompson had presided over countless cases, his rulings swift and absolute, his reputation built on a belief that he could read people the moment they walked in. He didn't need to know their names, their stories, just their place in the system. And today, the black woman standing before him was exactly where she belonged. She had walked into his courtroom with the quiet confidence of someone who had done this before. Yet to him, she was just another face in a long line of defendants. A minor traffic violation, a routine fine, nothing more. He barely glanced at her as he flipped through her case file, his gavel resting in his hand like an unspoken warning. She didn't argue, didn't protest, just stood there, poised, composed, waiting. Sarah Lawson knew the game. She had seen men like Thompson before, men who mistook their position for absolute power, who believed their black robes made them untouchable. She had faced worse, men with sharper tongues and colder eyes, men who wielded the law not as a tool of justice, but as a weapon of control. But she wasn't here to fight. Not yet. The courtroom was filled with the usual audience, a few board clerks, a handful of onlookers, a junior attorney typing notes at the prosecution table. A police officer leaned against the back wall, arms crossed, barely paying attention. This was just another day in court, just another case to be closed. And then, there was the foreshadowing. The first crack in the illusion. A young intern, no older than 23, sat in the front row, scribbling notes until her pen suddenly stopped. She frowned, tilting her head, as she looked at Sarah again. Something about the woman seemed off. Her posture, her tone, the way she didn't shrink under the judge's dismissive gaze. The intern shifted in her seat, leaning toward the clerk beside her. "Who is she?" she whispered. The clerk barely glanced up. "Just some woman with an overdue fine." The intern wasn't convinced. There was something in the way Sarah carried herself, something familiar, something important. But before she could say anything more, the judge spoke. "Miss Lawson." Judge Thompson sighed, his voice dripping with impatience. "You were cited for reckless driving. Your fine is set at $1,000, to be paid immediately. Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Sarah met his gaze without flinching. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. A tension no one else seemed to notice, but the intern felt it in her bones. Then, a single, almost imperceptible detail, a glint of silver against Sarah's wrist, a badge, just barely hidden beneath the cuff of her blazer, but there, undeniable. Judge Thompson didn't see it. No one else in the room did, but the intern did. Her breath caught in her throat. She knew that emblem, that insignia. And if she was right, if Sarah Lawson was who she thought she was, then this wasn't just a minor case. This was a mistake. A very, very big mistake. And Judge Thompson was about to find out just how big. Judge Richard Thompson barely suppressed a sigh as he leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping impatiently on the bench. He had already made his ruling. The woman should have accepted it and moved on. Yet there she stood, unshaken, composed. "I asked you a question, Miss Lawson," he repeated, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man used to instant obedience. "Do you have anything to say for yourself?" Sarah tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "No, Your Honor," she said finally, her voice smooth, deliberate. Not yet. There was something about the way she said it, something that made the intern shift in her seat again, her unease growing. Judge Thompson exhaled sharply, mistaking Sarah's composure for defiance. He had seen this before. People who thought they were smarter than the court, who carried themselves with an air of superiority, as if the law didn't apply to them. And more often than not, those people looked just like her. He smirked, leaning forward. "You know," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I see people like you all the time. People who think they can walk in here and play games with the law. But let me make something very clear. This is my courtroom, and in my courtroom, respect is not optional." A murmur rippled through the room. The officer in the back straightened slightly, suddenly more interested in what was happening. The junior attorney at the prosecution table smirked. They had all seen this before. A judge putting someone in their place. Sarah remained still, unmoved. Judge Thompson took her silence as an insult. He sat up straighter, his grip tightening around the gavel. "Very well," he said. "Since you seem to have trouble understanding simple consequences, allow me to clarify. I'm increasing your fine to $2,000, payable immediately." A few people in the room chuckled under their breath. The judge had made his point. Case closed. But then, Sarah smiled. It wasn't an arrogant smile. It wasn't forced. It was quiet, knowing, like someone watching a chess player celebrate a move without realizing they had just trapped themselves. She reached into her bag, pulled out a single sheet of paper, and walked forward. No hesitation, no fear. She placed it gently on the judge's bench. "Before you finalize that, Your Honor," she said, her voice calm, "you might want to read this." Judge Thompson frowned. He didn't like being challenged, not in his own courtroom. With an annoyed grunt, he grabbed the paper and glanced at it, expecting some desperate plea, some irrelevant argument meant to waste his time. But then, his eyes locked onto the letterhead. His fingers tightened involuntarily. United States Department of Justice. His gaze snapped back to the words beneath it, his own name, his court, and right at the bottom, in clear, bold print, Federal Prosecutor, Sarah Lawson. The room had been silent before, but now it was the kind of silence that gripped the air, thick with the weight of realization. The police officer in the back slowly straightened to his full height. The junior attorney's smirk vanished. The intern, who had been watching everything with growing suspicion, suddenly inhaled sharply. And Judge Thompson, Judge Richard Thompson, who had spent years ruling from a place of unchecked authority, felt the ground beneath him shift. Sarah watched him, her expression unreadable. "Do you have anything to say for yourself, Your Honor?" The words landed like a hammer. Judge Thompson opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His throat was dry. His mind raced, searching for an explanation, a way to salvage control of the room. But there was no control left to salvage. The power had shifted, and for the first time in his courtroom, he wasn't the one holding it. For the first time in his career, Judge Richard Thompson felt the weight of his own courtroom turn against him. The realization settled in slowly, a creeping dread clawing its way up his spine as he reread the document in his hands. Sarah Lawson, Federal Prosecutor. His grip tightened around the paper, but his expression remained carefully neutral. He had been in the legal system long enough to know that control was an illusion, one that could shatter in an instant if he wasn't careful. He looked up. Sarah was still standing there, watching him with the same measured patience, the same quiet confidence that now made sense. She wasn't defiant. She wasn't arrogant. She had known exactly what she was walking into, and she had let him play right into her hands. A lesser man might have stumbled, might have faltered, mumbled an apology, tried to correct his mistake before it spread like wildfire. But Richard Thompson wasn't a lesser man. He was a judge. This was his courtroom, and he wasn't about to let some prosecutor, especially a black woman, strip him of his authority in front of an audience. He set the paper down deliberately, folding his hands over it as he cleared his throat. "I see," he said slowly. His voice was steady, controlled. "So you're a federal prosecutor. That's quite the omission, Miss Lawson." Sarah didn't blink. It wasn't relevant. Until now. The intern in the front row sat frozen, her pen forgotten in her grip. The police officer in the back shifted uncomfortably. No one spoke. No one dared to move. Judge Thompson forced out a chuckle, shaking his head. "Well," he said, leaning back in his chair, "this is certainly an interesting situation. But let's be clear on something." He met her gaze, his tone hardening. "In this courtroom, it doesn't matter who you are. Everyone is equal under the law." A few people in the audience nodded, reassured by his words. The balance had been shaken, but Thompson was grasping at it, trying to pull it back into his favor. Sarah tilted her head slightly. "Is that so?" Something in her voice made him hesitate. She took a step closer, slow and deliberate. "Then tell me, Your Honor," she continued, "when was the last time you doubled a defendant's fine after they had already accepted their punishment?" A muscle in Thompson's jaw twitched. "Or is that privilege reserved for people who look like me?" she added, her voice soft, almost dangerous in its quietness. The air in the courtroom shifted. Judge Thompson bristled. "I don't appreciate what you're implying, Miss Lawson." Sarah didn't look away. "I don't need you to appreciate it. I need you to answer it." The silence that followed was suffocating. The junior attorney at the prosecution table swallowed hard, suddenly very interested in the blank document on his laptop. The police officer in the back was no longer leaning casually. He was watching, waiting, sensing the shift in power as clearly as everyone else. For the first time since he had picked up the gavel, Judge Thompson was the one on trial. He exhaled sharply, reaching for control the only way he knew how, through intimidation. He straightened in his chair, fixing Sarah with the same hard stare he had used to silence countless defendants before. "Miss Lawson," he said, his voice clipped, measured, "you may be a prosecutor, but in this room you are still a defendant, and I will not tolerate." Sarah moved, not aggressively, not forcefully, just calmly. She reached into her bag again, and for a split second, the entire courtroom tensed. The police officer's hand twitched toward his belt, as if expecting a threat. Even Thompson's fingers twitched near the gavel, but all Sarah did was pull out another document. And this time, when she placed it in front of him, the shift in the room became absolute. "Then let's make it official," she said, her voice smooth, controlled. "Because I'm filing a formal complaint against you, Your Honor. On record. Right now." Thompson froze. The junior attorney nearly choked on his breath. The police officer muttered something under his breath. The intern felt her heartbeat slam against her ribs. Because this was no longer just a tense moment in court. This was a war. Sarah stepped back, giving Thompson space to process the reality of his situation. "You accused me of disrespecting the law," she said. "So tell me, Judge, what do you call abusing judicial discretion? What do you call selectively punishing defendants based on your personal bias?" Thompson's face was flushed now, his mask of authority cracking under the pressure. "This is outrageous," he muttered, but his voice lacked the usual steel. Sarah's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "No, Your Honor," she said softly. "This is accountability." The courtroom was no longer his. It belonged to her now. Judge Richard Thompson had spent years mastering the art of control. His courtroom was his kingdom, his bench, his throne. He wielded his authority like a weapon, sharp enough to silence defendants, to command respect, to crush anyone who dared to challenge him. But not today. Not against her. The weight of Sarah Lawson's words pressed down on him like a gavel poised midair, waiting for the final strike. His fingers twitched against the armrest of his chair, his breathing measured, but tight. Around him, the courtroom was no longer just a collection of onlookers. It was a jury, watching, judging. For the first time in his career, he was the one on trial. His gaze dropped to the document she had placed before him. The official letterhead of the Department of Justice was unmistakable. The words, "Judicial Misconduct Complaint," stared back at him, cold and unwavering. His name, was listed beneath it. Sarah didn't move. She didn't need to. The damage had already been done. The courtroom, once ruled by the gavel in his hand, now belonged to her silence. The junior attorney at the prosecution table shifted in his seat, avoiding eye contact. The police officer at the back of the room was no longer leaning casually against the wall. He was standing straight, watching intently, like a man witnessing the fall of something once untouchable. The intern? She barely breathed. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone in the room could feel it. Thompson forced a chuckle, a weak, humorless thing. "Miss Lawson," he said, attempting to regain even a sliver of control. "This is highly inappropriate. Filing a complaint against a sitting judge in his own courtroom?" He scoffed. "This is nothing more than a stunt." Sarah arched a single brow. "A stunt?" She leaned forward, just slightly, her voice unwavering. "Judge Thompson, do you honestly believe I walked into this courtroom unprepared?" His breath hitched. "Do you think I didn't know exactly how this would play out?" She continued, her words smooth, cutting. "That I didn't anticipate every move you would make, every word you would say?" Thompson's mouth opened, then closed. Because the truth was suffocating. She had known. She had known exactly what kind of man he was before she even stepped through the doors. And he had played right into her hands. Sarah took another step forward, her presence commanding. "You think I'm filing this complaint for show?" She gestured to the room. "I don't need to." Her eyes locked onto his. "This courtroom is already watching you, and soon the entire system will be too." Thompson's fingers curled into fists. His authority, his reputation, his career was hanging by a thread, and she was holding the scissors. The intern in the front row finally exhaled, a slow, shaky breath. She had walked into this courtroom expecting just another case. Instead, she had witnessed history. Sarah didn't gloat. She didn't smirk or revel in his discomfort. She simply stood there, steady, waiting. Because she wasn't here for revenge. She was here for justice. And justice had just turned the tables. The weight of silence in the courtroom was suffocating. Judge Thompson sat rigid in his chair, his grip tightening around the gavel, as if holding on to the last remnants of his authority. But there was nothing left to hold on to. The junior attorney at the prosecution table exchanged a nervous glance with his colleague. The police officer at the back of the room shifted uncomfortably. Even the clerk, who had spent years working under Thompson, now refused to meet his gaze. Because everyone knew. This wasn't just a momentary loss of control. This was the beginning of his downfall. Sarah Lawson didn't move, didn't speak. She didn't need to. She had already won. The complaint on his desk was more than just words on a page. It was a reckoning. One that could not be ignored, could not be dismissed. Thompson cleared his throat, forcing his voice to remain steady. He stopped, swallowing hard. He had faced hardened criminals, seasoned attorneys, the most ruthless prosecutors in the system. Yet now, under the unwavering gaze of the woman he had dismissed as insignificant, he had no defense. A low murmur spread through the room. The realization was sinking in. The arrogance that had once dripped from his every word was gone. His power had evaporated before their eyes. Sarah let the silence linger. Then, with the same measured composure she had maintained from the start, she reached down, picked up her bag, and turned toward the door. No gloating, no last words, no need to rub salt in the wound, because the damage was already done. Judge Thompson sat frozen as she walked past him, past the prosecution table, past the audience who now looked at him with something they had never dared to before. Judgment. The gavel in his hand felt useless. The room no longer belonged to him. Sarah reached the doors and paused for just a second. Then, without turning back, she pushed them open and stepped into the hallway, leaving behind a courtroom where justice had finally found its balance. The heavy doors of the courtroom swung shut behind Sarah Lawson, sealing the moment in history. She didn't pause, didn't glance back. She didn't need to. The echoes of what had just happened would linger in that room far longer than she ever would. Somewhere inside, Judge Thompson sat motionless, his once unshakable authority fractured beyond repair. The murmurs would spread, the headlines would come, and soon, the system that had protected men like him for so long would have to answer for itself. But that wasn't her concern anymore. Sarah stepped into the hallway, her heels clicking against the polished floor, each step carrying the weight of accountability, not revenge. She had never walked into that courtroom looking for a fight, but she had made sure, without a shadow of a doubt, that no one would ever underestimate her again. A young law student sitting outside, waiting for her own case to be called, watched Sarah pass. She didn't say anything, just nodded, the silent kind of respect, exchanged between two women who understood the fight wasn't over. Sarah returned the nod, and then, with the same quiet confidence that had shattered an entire courtroom, she disappeared down the hall, leaving behind nothing but the undeniable truth. Power is not in a title. It's in the courage to stand your ground. What do you think? Have you ever witnessed a moment where justice finally turned the tables? Let's talk in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, stories of power, redemption, and the unexpected, make sure to subscribe. Because trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.